We're in Reno, and today we're interviewing Gary Edwards, who was a pilot for Air America for a long time, along with many other endeavors. Gary, tell us a little of your experience and start back in your early years.
Well, my very first airplane ride was in 1944. I lived in Walla Walla, Washington, and the Army Air Force had a big B-17 base there. And of course, during the war, the housing shortage was, right at the top of the list. And we had a pilot and his wife, he was a first lieutenant. They lived in our basement. So one day he came home and he said, "Gary, do you and your brother want to go for an airplane ride?" And I said, oh yes, because I used to we lived out by the base, and I used to pedal my bike and go out and stand by the fence and watch the B-17s go and everything, and just was totally enthralled by airplanes. And so he said, "Okay, come on, we'll go." And I thought we were going to the airbase. Well, we went to the civilian airport instead, and he threw us in the back of a little Cub, and off we went. We went around our house, and I was looking down, and you could see all the neighbor kids and waving and everything, and I was just really, really thrilled.
You were hooked.
I was hooked, and like I say, I guess I was 11 years old at the time, and never got to go on another airplane until I was a senior in high school, when I had a trip from Minneapolis, Minnesota to Washington, D.C. in an old DC-4, C-54. And so I went after graduation from school. I got a job on a Norwegian freighter, washing dishes and keeping care of the cabins of the guys that worked in the engine room. And I graduated when I was 17, so I didn't have to register for the draft because I wasn't 18, and the Korean War was going on. So I went away in June and came back in February of the following year, and as soon as I got back home, why, sure enough, there's a notification that I should register for the draft. So I said, well, that was sort of fun, sailing around the world and seeing all the different places, so I thought I'd go in the Navy. So I went in the Navy, went through basic training, boot camp, and passed all the exams for naval cadets. Well, I was young and a little wild and hadn't really taken on responsibilities yet, so they said, "Well, we just don't think you're really cut off to be officer material quite yet. Maybe let it ride for a year and a half," because I still had my orders to go to Pensacola to cadets. Well, I went to Pensacola anyhow, but make a long story short, I never got to the cadet program.
In other words, you screwed up along the way.
I had a little tendency to be late, maybe coming back to the camp, and had civilian clothes in my locker, and which was a no-no then, and so it was just, I've often wondered what would have happened if I'd gone into the naval there, but who's to know? And so I got out and went up to Seattle, Washington, where my folks lived, and started to fly on the GI Bill. Learned to fly on the GI Bill, and soloed at Boeing Field, Jim Gavin's flight service up there. It's still there. Jim is dead now, but finished and got my private, and then went on and got my commercial. And my mother-in-law was very, very ill at the time, and she lived in Des Moines, Iowa. So my wife, she wanted to go back to Iowa to take care of her mother. So we moved back to Des Moines, Iowa, and I finished my commercial there and got my multi-engine and instrument rating in Des Moines. And I, in the meantime, had a job with B.F. Goodrich, and I got fired because I was a credit manager and I wouldn't go down and repossess this lady's refrigerator. So I said, well, what the heck. Unfortunately, my mother-in-law had died, so we moved to California. And my aviation career came to a complete screeching halt. There was just, as you know, the aviation industry have highs and lows, and it was down in the valley and at this time, and no one was going to hire a 250-hour pilot to go to work. So I said, well, what the heck, I'll go back to college. And so I went back to school, and Vietnam got cranked up. This was about 61, 62. So the Army came out with the warrant officer program. So I went down and inquired about that, and they said, well, why don't you do it? And I said, well, okay, I will, because I really wanted to fly airplanes. So here I am, married, 2 kids, and they drive up the coast with me and drop me off at Fort Ord, and they go on up to Seattle. And I go to basic training, and at that time the Army had the guarantee program of what you wanted to do. And so I didn't sign up for just any pilot. I signed up for fixed wing because I figured that'd be the easiest, because I already had all my ratings and stuff. So the orders came down, and I was getting ready to go to Fort Walters, Texas, to rotary wing, and I said, I don't want any part of that. So I ran up to my CO, and I said, they showed me and guaranteed me that I'd go to fixed wing. Well, they got it all squared away. So I went down to Fort Rucker and started flight school all over again. And this was 1963. So finished and graduated in June of 64. In fact, this year is our 40th anniversary. And we're going to have a little reunion at Fort Rucker, so I'll be going down there in June. So my first assignment was the 11th Air Assault up at Fort Benning, Georgia. And go to Fort Benning, and find a place to live and everything. And so about after a month there at Fort Benning, they said, well, it's time to go on maneuvers. So I'd never done this, so they gave us a pup tent, and off we went out into the boondocks in northern Georgia and Carolinas. And we had about it was almost 60-day maneuvers for the real test for the 11th Air Assault. And came back to Fort Benning, and then had an interesting experience at Benning. They had a big flood out in Northern California, and they had a whole bunch of cattle and people stranded up in Northern California. So we flew about 10 airplanes, and we were flying the DHC-4 de Havilland Caribou. And so we go to Northern California out there for a while, and dumping hay and getting people out of flood-plained places up there, and came back, and President Johnson said that the whole 11th Air Assault Division was now going to be the 1st Cav Division, and we're going to go to Vietnam in September of 1965. So we took two 500-gallon bladders and put those inside the Caribou and filled those with fuel. And we had a separate oil tank also inside the fuselage of the airplane. So we took off from Fort Benning and made a sort of southerly route down across El Paso and San Diego, and then turned north and went up to not Moffett Field, but the Air Force Base. It was right across the Golden Gate Bridge. Hamilton Air Force Base. And that was just about the same amount of mileage as it was from Hamilton to Honolulu. So everybody made it. So we went from Hamilton to Honolulu, stayed a couple of 3 days in Honolulu, then went to Midway, stayed there overnight, then to Wake Island, and stayed there a couple of days, and then on down to Guam, then Clarkfield in Manila in the Philippines, and then over to Vung Tau, Vietnam. And we got our airplanes all back into shape and got the bladders out, and they sent us up to 2 Corps, up to Pleiku, Vietnam. And the reason we went there, the 1st Cav headquarters were going to be at a place called An Khie, and they didn't have room to park 18 Caribous on the ramp at An Khie, so we stayed at Pleiku, and then supported the 1st Cav. We were in the Battle of Ai Drang, and all of the offensives that were in the 2 Corps supporting the 1st Cav Division. Then about 6 months, they realized that all of the aviators in the 1st Cav Division were going to rotate at the same time, so they started swapping pilots from the 1st Cav to different aviation units all throughout Vietnam.
Now, when you say Cav, this is the 1st Cavalry.
1st Cavalry Division.
Without horses.
Without horses. We had helicopters for horses. But I was sent up to another aviation company in Da Nang up north in I Corps. And we were supporting strictly the Special Forces up in I Corps, and which was a very rewarding job. That every day that you came back home, Da Nang, why, you knew that you could see your results of what you were hauling. We hauled everything from live pigs, chickens, rice, all the Special Forces material, everything from boots to guns. And
were you still flying Caribous?
still flying the Caribous. And it was, like I say, a very rewarding job, because you could really see the results of your work at the end of the day. Well, my time to rotate back to the U.S. came in September of '66, and I was sent back to Fort Benning. And they said, well, we would like for you to learn how to fly the Chinook, the twin rotor helicopter. And I said, great, I'd love to do that. And they said, well, you have to extend for a year. Well, I had 8 months to do. And I said, well, okay, I'll extend for 4 months. And I said, no, you have to do your 8 months plus a year. So I knew that I'd be going back to Vietnam as a Chinook pilot. And while I was in Vietnam, one day sitting on the ramp at NK, matter of fact, this little silver and blue airplane, civilian airplane, landed, taxied up on the ramp, and this pilot jumped out And I said, I know that guy from Fort Benning. And sure enough, turned out to be a friend of mine. And he was a captain at Fort Benning. So went over and we started talking, and I said, what are you doing in this civilian airplane dressed in this gray uniform? He said, well, he says, I'm working for Air America. It's the CIA airline. And he said, you're going to do a second tour over here if you extend or stay in. And he said, might as well come on over and make some money. So when I got back to Fort Benning, why, I inquired and went up to Washington, D.C. for an interview. And as they asked me when was due to get out of the Army. And I told him, and some of the questions, he asked me if I'd ever pulled the tour duty in Vietnam. I said, yep. And he said, well, you know what it's like? And I said, yes, I do. So he said, well, if you get out on the 25th of June, he says, can you go to Taipei on the 26th? And I said, ooh, that's a little rapid. I said, I would like to stop on the West Coast and see my mother and father. And they said, okay. And I had gotten divorced after I got back from Vietnam. So I was a swinging bachelor, and I said, well, yeah, I'd like to go back. So ended up in Taipei on about the 4th of July. And the initial interview in Taipei, they asked me what type of airplanes I had flown with Air America. And I said, well, they had some Apaches. I said, I've flown Apaches. And I said, of course, I've flown the Caribou. You've got 3 or 4 Caribous. And I said, well, have you ever flown the DC-3, the C-47? And I said, well, I was a flight attendant while I was going to school to learn how to fly in Seattle. I said, I've got a whole lot of time in the back seat. And he said, you'll go to the DC-3s. So
your time as a flight attendant counted toward
I guess that's
time
true.
flying the airplane.
Time flying the airplane. I said, if you can put up for 1,800 hours in the back end of a DC-3, why, you should be able to fly an hour or 2 in the front. So I was sent to Saigon in, let's see, so this was January of '67. So I went to Saigon and got checked out in the Goody Bird. Flew for about 1.5 years as co-pilot in the Goody Bird, and checked out in the Pilatus Porter, the same little airplane that I saw taxiing up on K. It's a turboprop, Swiss-built airplane with a turbine engine in it. And of course, it was a very, very short field. We called it our fixed-wing helicopter, because if you had a 10-knot wind, you could land within 200 feet just easy as all get out. And so I flew the Porter for 2 years, and all the pilots, not me, but all the rest of the pilots senior to me, decided they wanted to form a union in Air America. Well, they didn't promote you seniority-wise in Air America. They promoted you on your ability. So I was ahead of a whole bunch of people, as were a lot of the light airplane drivers were captains, but there's some people that have been there longer, and they were still co-pilots. So they had a big shake-up, and so they gave us a choice of the station that you wanted to be transferred to when they finally deciphered everything and got everybody in a seniority type listing. And so I chose the 123s. I was bumped back to co-pilot, and I chose the 123s flying out of Vientiane up in Laos. So went home, packed my bags, got my suitcases, and I was up there, for about a year. And of course, with the war winding down, this is 1972 now, and the war is starting to wind down, and Air America started to furlough. So being on the bottom, why, I was up there for about a year, and then I got furloughed. But Air America was really quite an interesting, and I really don't know the adjective. It was uplifting, but yet it was a sad experience, because basically where we were, you could see that the U.S., we were not winning the war, and so it was disheartening in a way to go out and fly day after day after day and lose crew members. We have a little wall, what we call a wall memorial, down at the University of Texas in Dallas, and there's 280 some odd names on that wall of guys that were killed in Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, Burma, and some in North Vietnam. Air America did all of the downed pilot rescue operations in Southeast Asia until the Jolly Green Giants of the Air Force finally got in country. In fact, Air America picked up my brother-in-law, who was a Navy pilot, A6 intruder pilot. He was shot down over Laos, and Air America picked him up after he was on the ground for about 30 hours, and every year we have a reunion. And Don, my brother-in-law, when he came back to the U.S., after a period of time he was promoted, and he got to become a one-star admiral, and he was the commanding officer of the Flight Test Center at Patuxent River, Maryland. And this was 1985, and we had our reunion in Washington, D.C. in 1985, and so I got him to come down, and we got the helicopter pilot that picked him up, and it's the first time that they had met since he got off the helicopter when they brought him back to Vientiane. And so it was really quite a reunion.
I'm
quote,
sure
quote.
it was. Well, can you tell us some of the experiences that you had over there?
Well, I think one of the funniest experiences with Air America was one day, this is when I was flying the 123s, and we were up dropping what we call hard rice, which was ammunition to the Hmong tribesmen that were fighting the North Vietnamese up on what they called Plain of Jars, PDJ. And it was a very, very hot area, and we had two Air Force fighter escorts flying the old AD Skynight, the A1E, and they were one was on each wing. And we made about 3 runs into this special force, this Hmong camp, and we were just literally getting the heck shot out of us. And this little second lieutenant, or first lieutenant, flying one of the A1s, he radioed over to us. He said, "Man, I wouldn't have your job for nothing." And here he was making $850 a month, and we're in here making $5,000 a month. So I said, "Well, you're 20 feet away from us, buddy, and they don't shoot us very well anyhow. So you have our job at a much lower base pay." But gosh, there are just so many interesting things that did happen. I was in Saigon during the Tet Offensive in '68, and I roomed with, well, we had a villa together, this other Air America pilot, and he and I had gone to town the night before, downtown Saigon, and came back, and he brought a little bar girl home with him, and I lived on the top deck, and he lived downstairs, and I didn't have to fly that morning, but Tom did, and so I'm sleeping in. We had been down and whooped it up and had some Bommy Bob beers, 33 beer, and all of a sudden my bedroom door opened up, and here's Tom and his little girl, and they're crawling in on the floor, and she's going, "VC," and pointing out the window, "VC, VC." And I said, "Oh, what do you mean?" And so I got up and looked, and sure enough, here's 4 guys. They had B-40 rocket launchers, AK-47s, and it was daylight now, and they were basically looking for a place to hide. And we had walls around the houses we lived in fact, all of them. So I saw them go down the street, it was actually a little driveway, and they went into this yard about just one house, kittywampus down from our place. So I said, "Well, Tom, I don't think you're going to work today." And he said, "No, I don't think so either." So we just hunkered down in the house, and everything was quiet. So we fixed a little breakfast, and pretty soon a Vietnam.
Well, we were talking about Alaska. How long were you up there?
Yeah, I was up there for 3 years, and every time that I would come out of the house in the wintertime and have to scrape snow off the windshield, I usually had to scrape it off the wings of the airplane that I was going to fly that day. And I had the GI Bill still, and I thought, I think maybe I'd like to fly big airplanes. I'd never flown pure jets before. I had the 123s. We had the little jets out on each wing, but I'd never flown a pure jet. So I inquired down at American Airlines and to see if I could get a 707 type rating on the GI Bill. And they said, "Sure, love to have you down." So in January of '77, I went to Dallas and went through ground school there at DFW and got my type rating in the 707. So went back to Alaska and started calling around, and there was an outfit in Seattle called Aero, A-E-R-O America, which was a travel club, basically, flying out of Berlin. And this was a 121 operation. And they also had one 707 down in Cairo, Egypt, that was a Part 91 operation, and it went to Khartoum, Sudan, every morning. And they loaded up with freshly slaughtered beef. And then it would go back to Cairo at night. So I called down to Seattle and talked to this gentleman, and he said, "How much time do you have in a 707? And I said, 2 hours and 20 minutes. And there was a pause. And he said, "Can you go to Cairo tomorrow?" And I said, "Yeah, I can." So I had remarried, and I came home, and she was home, and I said, I'm going to Cairo, Egypt in the morning. Of course, she had no idea what to say, and sure enough, I went to Cairo, Egypt the next morning. And we lived out in Heliopolis. And like I say, every day we'd take off and go down to Khartoum and load and fly the beef back to Cairo. This went on for about 2 months, and they found out that I was 121 qualified, just coming from the American Airlines school. So they sent me to Berlin and to fly passengers, and this was really a sweet deal. I got to live in Berlin. You flew 4 days a week. You either flew Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, or Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. And we went all over the vacation spots in Europe. We went down to Tenerife. We went to a lot of places in southern Spain, Italy, just all over we would take the tourists down, offload, recater, refuel, refile, and the people that were already there, why we'd bring them back to Berlin. And it was a very, very nice deal. And that lasted only about 6 months. And I came back to the States and heard about this Pan American crew member, pilot, that had been furloughed, and he was starting an airline called Maverick, and they were going to haul dairy cattle from New York State up to Tehran, Iran. The Shah had a program at the time that he wanted to at least provide each Iranian child with at least 1 glass of milk during the day, and so he would get this at their school lunches. So I called a guy by the name of Joe Cooper, and he said, "Yeah, sure, come on, we'll go." And so I would deadhead from, I lived in San Diego at the time, and I would deadhead back to New York, and we would stage out of New York to Amsterdam, have a crew change in Amsterdam, and then the next crew would take it on to the cattle on to Tehran and offload, and then fly back to Amsterdam, and then the other crew would take it on back to New York. And he had 2 airplanes, and it really got to be involved in a pretty neat little operation. And a friend of mine who had been with me on a trip from Schenectady, New York to Taiwan, I found out about this trip, and it was just a one-shot deal for a Christmas deal. We went to Taiwan to pick up a whole bunch of the little electronic boards that go into electronic toys. And so he called me and he said, "There's an outfit in Kansas City that's starting to do the same thing as Maverick is doing, and they need one more captain." Well, I was just a co-pilot of Maverick, so I jumped at the chance and went to Kansas City and interviewed and got hired. And this turned out to be GIA, Global International Airways. And it grew to be a very, very large charter outfit. But it just started off hauling dairy cattle to Iran. And this was basically a 2-week on, 2-week off operation. And so we'd live in Amsterdam and then fly the Amsterdam-Tehran route. But then, of course, the Shah fell out of power, so there went all our contracts. So the owner of the airline started a little ad hoc air freight business, and so they sort of milled around a little bit, and he got some contacts with the State Department, and we started hauling aircraft parts to a place that I had never heard of, about 250 miles east of Cairo, Egypt. And anybody that's ever flown in the Mediterranean area knows that when you come down from Europe and to go into to Cairo, you take from the Mediterranean Ocean a little southeasterly heading and go about 200 miles and then make a hard 90-degree left turn to go into Cairo. Well, we would take off from Baltimore with all aircraft parts, F4F parts, and we would file for Cairo. And as soon as we made this hard left turn down in the Egyptian desert, we would fly to about 100 miles from Cairo and make another hard left turn and cancel our flight plan. And in about 8 minutes, there's two beautiful 10,000-foot runways with F4s just lined both sides of it. And this was, still don't know the name of the airstrip out there, but there was F4s that the United States government had down in the Egyptian desert. And so it was, I'm sure after the Russians left Egypt, why this was sort of a payment of some sort to try to modify or to coddle the Egyptians to stay on,
cultivate the friendship.
yeah, to stay on our side a bit. But the air freight business was, since it was an ad hoc go from here to there, it wasn't like UPS or FedEx. It was a little difficult, so he started into the charter passenger business, and we hauled passengers all over the world. It was very lucrative, and you got to go to really neat places. But I would bid the freighters just because it was a lot of fun. You got more diversified routes and stuff. You get a little tired of going from Detroit to Las Vegas. So, but we had some interesting trips while we were flying the freighters. I made 2 trips into mainland China, it was Peking then. After President Nixon and Henry Kissinger went to China, we were the second U.S. airplane into China after they had departed. And the Afghan war with Russia was going full tilt then. So we flew from down in the Mediterranean through the back door up through Nepal and the back way into Beijing, China, and took a load of arms, ammunition, mortar shells, everything that the Afghans needed for the war against the Russians, and went to Rawalpindi, Pakistan, and offloaded, and we made 2 trips into China. We had actual CIA boys on board that went with us and came back with us and made sure all of the stuff got to the right place anyhow. But that was rather interesting. We got to, we were there each time for a couple, 3 days, so we got to go to the Great Wall of China and get to see all the sights in Tiananmen Square and everything. We saw where the little guy stood out later in front of the tanks and made him stop at the Revolution. But I did go back to flying passengers for quite a while, and my first incident was when I had President Reagan's press corps on board, and we were down in Brazil, and he was making a tour of South America, and we were in the capital in Brasilia, and we had an early morning takeoff going back to Atlanta, and I had the airplane was configured into half cargo, half passengers, because we had all of the TV cameras, all of their sound equipment and stuff. We had quite a bit of TV press, just equipment, what they travel with. And on takeoff, we struck a cement ILS tower off the end of the runway and knocked main landing gear off. And so we went out and circled and dumped fuel till we get down to a halfway decent landing weight, and then came back in and landed and took a $8 million 707 and turned it into a bunch of pots and pans. Nobody got hurt. It was just a long slide down the runway and collapsed all the gear when we went off the side. But that was my little 15 minutes of fame on the CBS News at 6 o'clock back in the United States. But I enjoyed flying the 707. It was a good old airplane. You could do a lot of stuff with the 70. And we had one period of time with Global that they had a little Chapter 11 reorganization during this changeover from air freight into passengers. So some friends of mine that I flew with in Air America were living down in McAllen, Texas. So they said, hey, come on down. We need pilots down here. So I went down there. And they had DC-3s and the Super DC-3. The Marines called it the R4D8. And they had C-46s and DC-4s. And they were flying electronic gear into Mexico at night, because the Mexican Air Force did not fly at night. And it was all legal on the U.S. side. We would go through customs and immigration, and but once over the border, we'd cancel our flight plans and take off for the various little fields, and you'd fly for a couple hours, and pretty soon you'd see a flashlight waving somewhere out in the middle of the desert or a field or something, and pretty soon you'd come around and they had flare pots or truck lights out there, and you'd flaps and gear down and pull the power off and just hold it and wait till you crash on there. And I tell you, I never saw so many people unload an airplane as fast as they did. In 7 minutes, they would unload almost 4,000 pounds off a DC-3 of televisions and stuff. And you kept one engine running, and the co-pilot would run back and help offload. You'd get the airplane ready for takeoff, and he'd come up and they'd slam the door, and you'd crank the other engine, and off you'd go. And as soon as the wheels tucked into the gear came up, why, you'd say, oh boy, yep, made it. one more time. But had some of the guys get caught down there. They'd spend 9 or 10 days or 9 or 10 months in a Mexican jail. But I got caught one time, but didn't go to jail. It was around Christmas time, and McAllen, Texas, looked like the 8th Air Force in England. It was just airplanes going out, going south, taking all this stuff down to get ready for Christmas. And we were late, about an hour and a half. And when we landed, why, we were met by the right people, and we started offloading, and I'm in the cockpit, and I look down the field, and here comes a set of headlights. So I hollered out the window, and I said, here comes somebody, to my co-pilot, and he ran over and grabbed this Mexican guy, and he said, there's somebody coming. He said, oh, no problem, no problem. Well, I'm getting the flaps set, and I look back out the window again, and here's all the helpers and my co-pilot lying on the ground, and they've got their arms stretched out flat, and the guy's got a gun, and he waves it up to the cockpit, and he says, come on down. So shut down and get out. And he asked me if I had any guns, and I said, no. Armas? No, no armas. And so they took us into town, and I said, can I have a telephone? You have a telephone? So a guy gave me a cell phone, and I called the owner back in McAllen. That's about 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning now. And I said, man, we just got nailed down here. And he said, where are you? And I said, well, we're in town. He said, well, hide, the cops will get you. And I said, no, the cops already got us. And so he said, what's your number down there? And so I gave him the telephone number off the cell phone. And he went and got his girlfriend, who spoke fluent Spanish. And so pretty soon the cell phone rang, and they started talking. And he gave the phone back to me, and she said, okay, they're going to let you go. It's not going to be a problem. They thought that we had run 2 airplanes in without payment. They had to pay off. And so since we were so late, they thought the first airplane had already been there, and we were trying to sneak a load in there without paying. So anyhow, pretty soon they took us, and by now it's daylight. So I said, I don't want the Mexican Air Force find me going back up through Mexico. So we just firewalled it and went out over the Gulf of Mexico about 30 miles and headed north, and waited till we got even with Brownsville, and then cut back in over Texas. But that was my closest to joining some of my compadres in the jail down there. But that pretty well wraps everything up. I came back, and like I say, we did fly some more in the big airplanes, and then my aviation career came to a screeching halt one night on the shores of Colombia. Went down, I got a call one night, and they said, have you ever been to Colombia? And I said, yeah, of course I have. Because we used to fly 707s down there to Bogota to get, we'd bring back a whole airplane full of flowers. And the guy said, no, he said, I know that you used to smuggle into Mexico. He said, we have 3 people in the country illegally, and we would like to get them out. And so I said, well, I don't think so. And they said, well, one of them's a friend of yours from Air America, and comrade in arms. Why, I said, okay. So we went down, and sure enough, found the little strip that they had laid out in this field. And we landed and started to refuel and got all on board. And the guy that owned the airplane was not a pilot. He knew how to start the airplane and stuff like that. So we took off, and I brought the gear up, and I said, bring the flaps up 5 degrees, and he brought the flaps all the way up. And of course we bought the farm, really. Two of the guys that, well, my Air America buddy got killed, and the guy that owned the airplane got killed in the crash. And I was in the hospital for about 18 months in Colombia and then back in the U.S. So that was the end of my aviation career. Just
Well, that was in what kind of an airplane?
That was in a Piper Aerostar. And so I had one more takeoff than I had landing.
You were talking a minute ago about bringing flowers from down in there.
Yeah, they grow beautiful flowers there in Colombia, and we would fly down. We had a contract out of Miami, Florida, and we'd go to Bogota to land there about 9 in the evening, and there'd be 10 or 15 707s, and trucks would come out, big vans, semis, and load them up and bring them back to Miami. We get in about 6 in the morning, and they would ship these flowers all over the East Coast. They were just, especially in the wintertime, and it was a UPS or FedEx job, fly at night. But
how long a flight? Would you fly down and come back the same day?
Same night. Yeah, we would leave about 6 or 7 in the evening, and get to Bogota, and then we just sit in the airplane until they got it loaded, and then we would refile and take off again for Miami.
How much flying, or how long a flight is
It was
it?
about 3 hours down there, 2:55, I think, 3 hours, something like that, if my memory serves me correct. But yeah, Bogota is inland, a couple of 200 miles in Colombia. But lucrative business. It's still done to this day. They bring some awful nice stuff, the flowers in.
Well, it sounds like you've had an extremely interesting career.
It was. I wouldn't change it. I've had wonderful time. I've met people that are friends of yours that you know, Fish Salmon, Tony LeVere, Sam Hanks. It's just a great camaraderie of people, and the aviation business is a relatively small group, and they all basically seem to be the same people, same type of people. They enjoy a good time. They enjoy friendship, and it was a great life, and I'm still looking forward to it.
Well, I think in my own life, the people that I've met are some of the most interesting in the world.
They are.
I haven't met very many brain-dead pilots.
Yeah, that's true. They're a good group, and it seems to take a certain individual that really stays in aviation, and if you can enjoy it half as much as I did, I tell you, it's a blessing. It was a lot of fun.
Out of all of the airplanes that you've flown, do you have a favorite?
Oh, wow. I guess for nostalgia, for just the art of flying, would be the Cub. I enjoyed flying the 707. I guess the 707 probably from a quote unquote flying airplane, that would be one of my favorite. That'd be the favorite. Of course, I flew 3,000, 4,000 hours in the DC-3, and that's a lovely old airplane. I remember when I got out of the DC-3s in Air America, and I went back down to McAllen, Texas. And my first ride in the DC-3 again, it had been, oh gosh, 10, 12 years. I just couldn't believe the feeling that I got when you cranked those two old round engines up and popped the flaps down. And I remember you have a certain way of putting your hydraulics. You got a hydraulic handle on the co-pilot side. You have to put it down, and then you put your flaps down, and then bring it back to neutral, and all this really old-time stuff. And you manually lock the gear down with your right toe in the captain's seat, and it just came back that quick, and it was a wonderful, wonderful feeling. It almost brought a tear to your eye, you know.
Well, Gary, I really thank you.
It's my privilege. It was just my pleasure, Joe. And I'm anxious to, when you compile all of these interviews, I really want to see it, because it's like I'm very appreciative for what you're doing, because there is a lot of history to be had, and just in our little group, the Monongaros.
In our Monongaro group, there is so much history. That's what prompted this, was the looking around at the people in there and the things that they've done. It's an amazing thing that there's this many people in one community.
And that's right. That's very true. I want to thank you, Joe.
My pleasure.